President Trump doesn't seem to be toning down his rhetoric in an ongoing war of words with North Korea. The president hosted Spanish Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy in the Rose Garden this afternoon. The two leaders held a joint news conference where Mr. Trump thanked Spain for, quote, standing with the United States in efforts to isolate the North Korean regime.
It is time for all responsible nations to join forces to isolate the North Korean menace. North Korean nuclear weapons and missile development threaten the entire world with unthinkable loss of life. All nations must act now to ensure the regime's complete denuclearization. I have recently issued tough new sanctions against those who do business with this outlaw regime, and I applaud China's latest action to restrict its trade with North Korea. And in particular, I applaud China for breaking off all banking relationships with North Korea, something that people would have thought unthinkable even 2 months ago. I want to thank President Xi.
Joining us now is Michael Allen, a managing director at Beacon Global Strategies, a firm that specializes in international policy and defense. And Michael, I know your resume is a lot longer than that, but I want to get into the issue of North Korea now. You know, the president, before he made comments like there is still this second military option and we would devastate North Korea, as you heard, seemed to put some emphasis on diplomacy and letting these sanctions work. Do you see a path right now to where diplomacy could lead to the Trump administration's goal of denuclearization?
Denuclearization is going to be a very tough goal, but it's been our policy for decades. I think what the Trump administration is trying to do are several things. One, ramp up the sanctions so as to enable a diplomatic option. Two, put more forces in the region so that we might make the Chinese more uncomfortable so that they might put some pressure on the North Koreans. And finally, I think we are newly open to selling more weapons to our allies, South Korea and Japan. And that's another thing China hates. And frankly, they're the key to diplomacy because they have the most leverage over this really hermit regime in North Korea.
And do you think they will finally use their leverage? The president praised Xi Jinping today in that Rose Garden press conference, saying that China's actions to restrict trade are a step forward in these sanctions. Is China using its leverage now?
They're certainly using some of their leverage. Look, I was as struck as anybody by the fact that the president has switched from criticizing the Chinese premier to praising him. And so I think he is trying to induce more cooperation. They do have a summit coming up in May. But I think the objective of the president's rhetoric, although it does get a little heated at times, the objective is sort of the madman theory of international relations. The Chinese have to believe that President Trump is willing to go there on military options, and that, in theory, inspires them to put more pressure on the North Koreans to bend to the will of the international community.
Wasn't it Nixon that came up with the madman theory? And I guess my question is, yesterday I had an expert on CBSN who said this is dangerous. The rhetoric is dangerous. Do you disagree with that?
I don't disagree. Look, it is a dangerous game to try and match the North Korean leader in terms of bombastic rhetoric. The reason is that we don't have a great cultural understanding of their regime, how they operate. We don't necessarily have a full picture on how they make decisions. And so that leads to the possibility that they might misinterpret what the president says and take a rash action. So I get what the president's trying to do, which is increase the pressure, but there's a point of diminishing returns, and I think we've probably gotten there, where you're going to introduce too much uncertainty into the equation.
Could that rash action include shooting down U.S. bombers over international airspace, as North Korea's foreign minister threatened yesterday?
It all gets down to this very interesting question on what our policy is based on, and that is whether the North Korean leader is indeed rational. I think it's the position of the U.S. government that he is. He did show some weeks ago when we threatened him with regard to his comments on Guam that he was willing to pull back from the brink.
True.
If he were to go so far as to take shots at our planes, I think he would know that that would be a hostile act. I think he would be more likely to maybe take some shots like he's done in the past at some South Koreans, maybe take some hostages that are somewhere near the DMZ, or otherwise, God forbid, he's threatened recently to do a nuclear test above ground, something we haven't seen probably since the 60s or 70s. So those would be huge ratcheting up the pressure on his part, and I think the U.S. would have to respond.
This may be out of bounds, but some would say and ask whether we're dealing with two rational actors.
Right.
And whether Kim Jong-un thinks that President Trump is a rational actor. How does that play in to this brinksmanship?
Well, it's dangerous. I mean, there is a debate going on whether, hey, listen, do we need to ratchet up the rhetoric so as to let the North Koreans know that this is not the presidencies of the past, that we're in a new ball game? Or should we try and reassure them to such a degree that, hey, listen, we're not going to do anything rash, but you have to denuclearize? President Trump is clearly going with the first option, which is to ratchet up the rhetoric. I did think it was a little strange during the press conference just now that he said, hey, listen, it's not me. I'm always replying. It sounded sort of like what my sons might say. It's not me initiating the insults. I was just replying to them. And so that tells me that someone has talked to him about it, and he's trying to be conscious of the fact that he may overdo the rhetoric.
Michael Allen, thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you.